Welcome to the US or let's take a little trip. You're not packing a suitcase or booking a flight. Just close your eyes and imagine stepping into a time machine with a wobbly dial and a label that says, Destination, Soviet Union, sometime. In the late 1970s, you hit the big red button. And poof! Suddenly, you're not in Kansas anymore, or Canada, or anywhere remotely modern. You're in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the good old USSR. It's huge. Really, really huge. In fact, it's the biggest country the world has ever seen. It stretches from the cold forests near Finland all the way to the mountains brushing China. 11 time zones, over 280 million people, and most of them just trying to live their lives without freezing, starving, or accidentally upsetting the KGB. The first thing you might notice, it's cold, not grab a sweater cold. More like I can't feel my face cold. People walk fast, wear heavy coats that smell like mothballs, and carry serious-looking briefcases that might actually thus be holding sandwiches. Now, before we go deeper, let's make something clear. Life in the USSR wasn't all gray skies and secret police. It wasn't always grim, but it definitely wasn't easy either. The average Soviet citizen, let's call him Ivan, wasn't a spy or a soldier. He wasn't building nuclear weapons or plotting revolutions. Ivan worked in a factory or an office. He lived in a small apartment, stood in a lot of lines, drank a lot of tea, and just tried to get by. Politics. Most people didn't talk about it. Freedom? Not much of that. Comfort? Depends on how you define it. Now, look around Ivan's world. Everywhere you go, there are giant posters of Lenin's face. He's always looking off into the distance like he knows something you don't. Red flags flutter from buildings. Statues of workers holding hammers and sickles look super intense, even when it's snowing sideways. Everything is state-owned. The factories, the farms, the stores. Even your apartment belongs to the government. You can live in it for life, but you don't own it? Technically, nobody owns anything, except maybe a pair of wool socks and a samovar. There's this big idea hanging in the air. Comrades, we are building a better world together. But for most people, that world feels a little slow and kind of broken. Still, Soviet citizens found their own rhythm. Life wasn't all doom and gloom. Kids played outside until their cheeks turned pink from the cold. Families gathered around tiny TVs to watch ballet, hockey, or maybe a black and white war movie for the 37th time. Grandmothers, or babushkas, ran the world quietly from behind the scenes, armed with soup pots and strong opinions. Now, let's say you want to go buy something. Anything. A loaf of bread. Some shoes. Maybe a can of condensed milk. Well, buckle up. You're going to wait in line, a long line. In fact, you're probably going to ask what the line is for after you've already been standing in it for 10 minutes, because in the USSR, if people were lining up, it usually meant something good was at the end. Or at least, not terrible. Stores were strange. Half the shelves might be empty. The lighting was dim. The cashier looked like she hadn't smiled since Brezhnev took power. You'd hold onto your rubles, the Soviet currency. But honestly, money wasn't always the issue. The issue was availability. People learned to trade, hoard, and rely on personal connections. If your cousin's wife's uncle worked in a meat factory, you were golden. If not, well, hope you like cabbage, but even with all that, people survived. Some even smiled. See, Soviet life had a rhythm. You'd wake up, drink strong tea from a chipped cup, maybe eat some black bread with butter if you were lucky. Then you'd head off to work, wrapped in layers like a human onion. You'd ride a crowded bus or a rattling metro, sharing space with strangers who all looked equally sleepy. At work, you didn't really have to be super productive. In fact, one popular joke went, "We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us." The system wasn't exactly efficient, but hey, everyone had a job. And at the end of the day, you'd go home, eat dinner probably involving potatoes, and maybe listen to the radio until bedtime. And bedtime came early. After all, the winters were long, the days were short, and the heating, well, let's just say it worked. When it felt like it. Despite the cracks in the system, most people weren't plotting revolutions. They were just living. Yes, there was fear of saying the wrong thing, of being reported, of stepping too far out of line, but more often there was routine. A strange comfort in knowing exactly what every day would look like, even if it wasn't very exciting. And there was pride, too. Soviet people were told they were part of something grand, a society without rich or poor, where everyone had a place. That dream didn't always match reality, but it gave people a reason to keep going. So here we are. In the middle of the USSR, snow crunching underfoot, smell of boiled cabbage in the air, Lenin watching you from a poster that's seen better days. It's not glamorous, it's not free, but it's real. And for millions of people, this was simply life. Now, let's move in a little closer. Let's open the door to one of those boxy gray apartment buildings and step inside. Home Sweet Khrushchev Kali. We're inside now. Step carefully. The floor might creak, and someone's babushka is probably peeking at you through a slightly open door. Welcome to a Soviet apartment block, the famous Khrushchevka. Now, that's a big word, but don't worry, you don't have to spell it. Just know this. It's named after Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader who thought, hey, we need to house millions of people fast and cheaply. And so, the Khrushchevka was born, a type of low-rise, prefab apartment building made of concrete panels and dreams. These buildings popped up everywhere in the USSR from the 1960s onward. They were like fast food, but in building form. Not pretty, but got the job done. Let's head inside one of these beauties. First, the stairwell. It smells like old paint, boiled potatoes, and maybe a hint of cat. The walls are painted too. Tones, dull green on the bottom, faded white on top. Why? Because apparently it was easier to clean. It wasn't. Now up we go. No elevator here unless you're lucky enough to live in a 5-story version that broke the rules. Most Khrushchevkas are walk-ups. So, you get free cardio with your rent. We reach the landing and knock on the door. It's made of thick wood, reinforced with metal. If the owner was paranoid or had some connections at the factory, the door opens. Welcome to your Soviet apartment. It's tiny, really tiny. We're talking 35 to 45 square meters for a whole family. That's like fitting your life into a large shoebox. But it's your shoebox, and you waited years to get it, because in the USSR, you didn't just buy an apartment, you got one assigned to you by the government, after submitting requests, waiting, and maybe dropping hints to the right person. It wasn't unusual to wait 10 or even 15 years for your turn. Once you got it, though, that key was golden. Let's take a little tour. The hallway is narrow, shoes go by the door, coats on hooks, and probably a mirror so you can check if your hat is on straight before heading out. To the left, the kitchen. the heart of the home, and by heart, I mean a room the size of a generous closet. It's got a gas stove with matches, of course, a tiny fridge, and maybe a table that folds down from the wall. You've got pots hanging, tea glasses in a rack, and probably a radio humming in the background. You'll hear boiling water, the clink of spoons in glass cups, and your neighbor's entire life through the wall, because those walls. Paper thin, you sneeze, they say bless you. Cooking smells fill the whole apartment. Cabbage soup, fried, onions, fish, it all blends into that classic Soviet aroma. If you grew up there, it's oddly comforting. If not, maybe just crack a window. Now onto the living room/bedroom/everything room. It's multifunctional. During the day, it's where you drink tea, host guests, and listen to state radio. At night, the couch unfolds into a bed. Or maybe there's a wall bed, a magical piece of furniture that disappears upright when not in use. Furniture is usually big, dark, and heavy. You've got a wall unit, those giant wooden monsters with glass doors, packed with dishes you never use, books no one reads, and maybe a porcelain dog or two. These wall units were a Soviet status symbol. The more shelves, the fancier you were, and don't forget the rugs. On the floor? Yes, but also on the walls. Why? Because insulation, and maybe a bit of style. Nothing says cozy like a giant Persian style rug above your bed. Next, the bathroom. Sometimes, it's a combined toilet and bath. Sometimes, it's two separate closets. Either way, it's small. The water pressure is optimistic. Hot water comes and goes, and the pipes make noises like they're alive and angry. Toilet paper, if you can get it. If not, well, old newspapers have many uses. And finally, let's not forget the neighbors. In many cases, you're not alone in your apartment, you share it. Yes, it's called a kommunalka, a communal apartment where multiple families live together, each in their own room, but sharing the kitchen and bathroom. Want to brush your teeth. Get in line. Want to cook dinner. Hope someone didn't already claim the stove. Privacy, not really a thing. But over time, people develop systems, unspoken rules, a rhythm of survival. Still, the walls had ears, sometimes literally, whether it was nosy neighbors or the actual state. You learn to whisper your real thoughts behind closed doors. Despite the tight space, people made it work. Holidays were a big deal. The table would suddenly overflow with food, pickled things, mayonnaise salads, cakes, and maybe even some contraband sausage if you knew a guy. People decorated with whatever they had. Sheep tinsel, paper garlands, and those thick, colorful curtains that never quite matched the wallpaper. Speaking of wallpaper, it peeled, always, no matter how many times you glued it back. And it often had weird floral or geometric patterns that somehow made every room feel dim even with the lights on. Now, take a deep breath, feel that warm, steamy air. That's because the radiators are working overtime. Soviet heating was centralized. The state decided when the heat came on and when it went off. Too bad if it was still cold in October or boiling in April. The best part, you didn't pay rent like we do today. Technically, you paid a symbolic fee, like 5 or 10 rubles a month. Heat, gas, electricity, also cheap. So even if you didn't have much, at least you had a roof over your head. That said, people didn't always feel free or comfortable. They just adapted, made do, sewed curtains from old bed sheets, built shelves out of scrap wood, fixed things instead of buying new. And they laughed, a lot, Jokes were cursi. Like this one. What's the longest word in Russian? Deficit, because there's a shortage of every letter. Living in a Khrushchevka was cramped, noisy, and sometimes frustrating. But it was also full of life. Kids running around in slippers, mothers boiling soup, fathers fixing radios, and babushkas yelling from the balcony for someone to come inside before they caught a cold dot. It was never fancy, never luxurious. But it was home. So now that we've gotten cozy, let's get to the other big part of Soviet life, work. A job for everyone, whether you liked it or not. Time to get up. The radiator's clanking, someone's frying onions in the kitchen, and outside it's still kind of dark even though it's morning. Welcome to a workday in the Soviet Union. In the USSR, you didn't ask, should I get a job? You had one. Everyone did. That's how it worked. The state promised full employment, which meant that every adult had a place to be Monday through Friday, whether they liked it or not. Let's get dressed. Nothing fancy. You've got 2 good shirts, one for work, one for special occasions. Maybe you ironed it last night. Maybe you didn't. Either way, it's clean, and that's good enough. Now off to work, on foot, by bus, or squeezed into a packed metro where everyone's quiet and smells faintly like damp wool. You don't complain. You just breathe through your scarf and count the stops. Your destination could be one of many places, a factory making shoes, steel pipes, or TV parts that don't always work. An office where you push papers and fill out forms with a lot of stamps. A Cocos, a state-run farm, if you're out in the countryside, or maybe a school, hospital, or research lab, if you're lucky, and educate wherever you go. The vibe is the same. It's gray, it's routine, and it's just what you do. Let's say you work in a factory. You walk past a giant Lenin portrait on the wall, punch your time card, and head to your station. Machines whir. People shuffle in slowly, still waking up. There's a smell, part oil, part sweat, part cabbage from someone's lunchbox. You don't have to be super efficient. In fact, no one really is. You do your tasks, you hit your quota. But there's a popular saying around here. They pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. It's not just a joke, it's kind of the truth. You get a salary, but it's not much, and the work, let's just say the motivation, ain't exactly sky high. People often take their time, stretch coffee breaks, and don't rush. Why? Because the job is guaranteed. You're not going to get fired for being slow. Unless you say something political, that's the real danger. Messing up your welding job. Meh, but saying the wrong thing about the party. Now that's risky. Every workplace has a party representative, by the way. They make sure people behave, keep morale high, and remind you, subtly or not, that Big Brother is always listening. But back to the daily grind. You work in shifts. There's a lunch break with tea and bread. Maybe soup if the canteen's feeling generous. After lunch, you go back to your post. Machines groan. People chat quietly. You mark time not by the clock, but by the rhythm of the day. Now, not all jobs are manual. If you're in an office, things look different, but not that different. You've got a desk, a rotary phone, stacks of papers tied with string, and probably a rubber plant in the corner that's dying a slow, dignified death. Soviet offices loved paperwork. One form for ordering a chair, another to confirm you received the chair, a third to confirm you've confirmed the receipt of the chair. Everything needs a stamp, sometimes 2, sometimes 20. Still, office workers found ways to cope. Long tea breaks, quiet conversations. secret crossword puzzles hidden inside reports. And let's talk about jobs for women, because in the USSR, women worked too. It wasn't a question. You could be a teacher, a nurse, a factory worker, even an engineer. You were expected to do your job and take care of the home. Soviet women were strong, not just because they had to be, but because there wasn't another option. Childcare was provided by the state, which helped. Kindergartens, preschools, you dropped the kid off and hoped they wouldn't come home singing "Long Live the Tractor" again. They probably would. Now, here's the funny part. Even though everyone had a job, that didn't mean the economy worked well. In many places, people were employed just to keep them employed. You might have 10 people doing a job that needed to, or someone whose full-time job was handing out keys, or turning lights on and off. Seriously, productivity wasn't the goal. Stability was, and yet, workers took pride in what they did. They decorated their lockers. They formed choirs and sports teams. Every workplace had a Worker of the Month board. Even if everyone knew it rotated through the same 5 people, there were slogans everywhere: work for the glory of the motherland. Labor is honor. 5-year plan in 4 years. Spoiler: it never was. The party wanted people to feel like heroes, not just workers, but builders of a grand socialist future. And some people truly believed in that. Others just wanted to make it to the weekend. Speaking of weekends, they were sacred. 2 days off, time to breathe, go to the market, visit family, or just sit in your kitchen, sip tea, and listen to a radio drama while the samovar bubbles. Vacations. Oh yeah. You didn't get to choose your dates or destinations freely, but everyone got time off. The state even sent workers to sanatoriums, spa-like places with mineral water and massages, where you rested for the sake of production. Not bad, right? But even in all this routine, people dreamed of a different job, a different life. Some people found joy in small things: a good cup of tea, a new book, a laugh in the break room, and some just kept going, day after day, because that's what life was. So, when you imagine Soviet workers, don't just picture factory smoke and gray buildings. Picture a guy named Boris telling the same joke for the 5th time while fixing a machine with a wrench he borrowed from someone's cousin, or a woman named Galina organizing a Women's Day party while typing forms with her elbows because she's that efficient. These weren't just cogs in the system. They were people with tired feet, stubborn hope, and a talent for surviving the absurd. School, Soviet style: arise and shine, comrade. It's time for school. You're maybe 6 or 7 years old, still a little sleepy, hair sticking up in weird directions. But your mom's already making kasha, a warm, mushy porridge, and ironing your school uniform like her life depends on it, because in the USSR, school wasn't just a place to learn math and spelling. It was where you became a model Soviet citizen, or at least tried to. Let's start with the uniform. If you're a girl, brown dress, white apron, and hair tied up in 2 giant fluffy bows, we're talking satellite dish size. If you're a boy, dark trousers, white shirt, sometimes a jacket. And, of course, the red necktie. That's the symbol of the Young Pioneers, the official Soviet kids organization. Basically, baby communists in training. You'd swear an oath to Lenin, salute with your hand in a dramatic sideways angle, and chant slogans like, "Always ready. For the cause of Lenin, be ready." Once you're dressed and fed, it's off to school, usually on foot or by tram. You carry a leather briefcase that's somehow heavier than you are. Inside, notebooks, pens, maybe a sandwich, and probably a poem you forgot to memorize. Soviet schools were pretty strict. Everyone sat in rows, facing the teacher. No slouching allowed. There were portraits of Lenin and sometimes Stalin, depending on the decade, hanging at the front of the classroom, watching you like the ultimate principal. The day starts with the anthem. Maybe some marching, maybe a short speech from the teacher about discipline and good behavior. Then come the lessons. Here's what's on the menu: Russian language and literature, Pushkin, Tolstoy, and grammar drills that could make grown men cry, mathematics, algebra, geometry, and lots of chalk on blackboards, history, mostly Soviet history, with a strong emphasis on how awesome Lenin was and how terrible the West is. Natural sciences, biology, physics, chemistry, handwriting. Yes, it was an actual subject. Physical education, lots of running, sit-ups, and awkward group gymnastics. And don't forget the military prep classes for older kids, because who doesn't want to practice crawling under barbed wire between geometry lessons? But it wasn't just about learning facts. School was also about morals, behavior, and collective responsibility. Teachers had the power of tiny dictators. If you were late, talked back, or forgot your homework, it wasn't just a bad grade. It could go on your permanent record, and that record followed you from school to university to job applications. So yeah, no pressure. That said, some teachers were beloved, old ladies with kind eyes and tea-stained fingers, or ex-soldiers who told war stories instead of teaching real history. Others, not so much, especially the ones who assigned 10 pages of cursive writing as punishment. Lunch happened in the school cafeteria, or stolovaya. You'd get soup, always soup. A meat cutlet that may or may not be meat, mashed potatoes, and compote. A warm fruit drink that was more sugar than fruit. Was it tasty? Sometimes. Was it enough? Usually not. But you were a kid. You got used to it. After lunch, more lessons. Maybe some labor education where you learned how to hammer a nail, sew a button, or, weirdly, plant potatoes. Everyone had to help out with school cleanup, too. That meant sweeping classrooms, washing blackboards, or scrubbing hallways. No janitors. Just child labor with a patriotic twist. Now let's talk about homework. You get home, maybe have a snack, and then it's time to sit at the kitchen table for hours, copying things by hand in your notebook. There's no internet, no YouTube to help, just a textbook, your notes, and maybe an older sibling who's already given up. Some kids go to music school or sports clubs after regular school. Piano lessons were popular. So was chess, because, of course, in the USSR, chess was serious business. And when the day's finally over, you pack up and get ready to do it all again. Now, school wasn't just about books and discipline. There were also ceremonies. Lots of them. Joining the Young Pioneers, a huge deal, with speeches, songs, and the sacred red scarf. Lenin's birthday, a classroom party with poems and possibly jelly desserts. May Day, where you marched in parades, waved flowers, and pretended you were having fun standing outside for 2 hours. And yes, there were tests. Some important, some terrifying. One especially nerve-wracking moment was the university entrance exam. If you failed, you didn't go to college. You went to work, period. So, students studied hard, or at least tried to. Some were model citizens with neat notebooks and pioneer badges polished to a shine. Others were more creative, finding ways to nap through lectures or hide cheat notes in their sleeves. And through all this, kids were constantly told, You are the future of the Soviet Union. Study well, behave well, and build socialism. No pressure. Right. But here's the thing. School wasn't just about control. It was also about connection. Kids made lifelong friends. Shared crayons and secrets. Passed notes. Had crushes. Teamed up for snowball fights during recess. There were jokes, pranks, quiet laughter when the teacher's chalk broke for the third time in a row. Even in the strictest system, kids still found ways to be kids. So picture it, a row of tiny desks, a globe that hasn't been updated in decades, a teacher with a pointer stick and a fierce love of Pushkin. Outside, the snow's falling. Inside, someone's reading a poem with way too much drama. It wasn't perfect, but it was school. And in the end, even the most tired kid in the back row, half asleep, tie crooked, boots still wet from the snow, would probably remember these years with a strange kind of warmth. Now that we've passed our spelling test and survived a stern look from the principal, it's time to hit the streets. Standing in line for everything. Let's say you wake up one morning in the Soviet Union, look out your window, and see something truly exciting. A line, just a random line of people standing quietly on the sidewalk. You don't know what they're waiting for. It could be shoes, or bananas, or maybe toilet paper. Doesn't matter. You grab your coat, your hat, and your reusable shopping bag, because if there's a line, there's something worth having. Welcome to the unofficial national sport of the USSR, waiting in line. This wasn't just an occasional thing. It was a way of life. People lined up for everything: bread, meat, books, soap, milk, winter boots, baby formula, you name it. If it was useful or tasty, you had to wait for it, sometimes for hours, and no one complained. Well, okay. Everyone complained, but they still stood there. Let's start with the why. Why all the lines? It wasn't because the USSR was poor. The country had resources, factories, and clever people. But the planned economy, where the government decided how much of everything should be made, didn't always line up with what people actually needed. So, one day your local store might be overflowing with rubber galoshes. The next day, no milk for a week. One joke sums it up perfectly. What happens when the dessert becomes socialist? Nothing for a while. Then they run out of sand. So what do you do when you see a line? You get in it. First, ask questions later. Seriously, people would join lines just in case. You might ask the person ahead of you, "What are we waiting for?" And they'd shrug and say, "Not sure, but if it's something, I don't want to miss it." Sometimes, the thing at the end wasn't even something you wanted. A dusty can of sardines, a strange-looking vegetable, or the world's driest bread. Still, you stood there, because maybe you could trade it later. The length of the line wasn't always about scarcity. Sometimes stores didn't open on time, or the delivery truck was late, or the cashier was on break, or the power went out, or all of the above. So a simple shopping trip turned into a half-day event. You'd bring a friend, or a folding stool, maybe even knitting, because if you were gonna wait, might as well be productive. Let's talk about queues for meat. Getting good meat was like winning the lottery. You had to get lucky, or know someone, or have an aunt whose neighbor's cousin worked at the meat distribution center. But most people, they waited. They stood in lines for frozen chunks of beef that still had mystery bones attached, or sausages, with no label, no ingredients, and no flavor. But hey, it was protein, and that counted. Fruit was even more special. Oranges. Maybe once a year, around New Year's, bananas, exotic, rare, and slightly magical. If a shipment of bananas arrived, the entire block would find out. News traveled faster than light. Mothers would drag their kids across town just to snag a bundle of slightly green, bruised treasures, and toilet paper. That's a whole story on its own. Soviet toilet paper was rough. Literally, like sandpaper that's lost the will to scratch. And often, there wasn't any at all. So people stood in line for it like it was gold. When they got it, they'd proudly carry the rolls home, usually hanging them from a string on their wrist, like trophies. Want to know a real Soviet flex? Having extra toilet paper at home. Let's not forget clothing stores. Need a new pair of boots? Be ready to stand outside the store at 5 a.m., in the snow, in the dark, hoping your size will be available. If it is, they'll toss the shoes onto the counter in a pile. No boxes, no sorting, just a mad scramble of people grabbing and shoving, trying them on. Theft, you'll do that at home if they don't fit. Trade with your neighbor, or your cousin, or just wear 3 pairs of socks and deal with it. Sometimes, you'd get a ration coupon, a little paper slip that allowed you to buy something specific. Sugar, oil, butter, these were all rationed at various times. You couldn't buy it just because you had money. You needed the right coupon. So now you had to stand in 2 lines, one to get the coupon, one to get the actual item. Efficiency, not really the vibe. Of course, if you had connections, life was easier. This is what they called blat, a kind of informal network where favors got you things money couldn't. You knew a guy who knew a guy who could maybe find a radio or a better cut of meat or a spare refrigerator. But if you didn't have blat, you waited. And people made it work. They brought their kids, their friends. They took turns, they chatted, they told jokes, they gossiped. They formed temporary communities right there on the sidewalk. Standing in line wasn't just frustrating, it was social. And sometimes, it was even kind of fun. Okay, not fun, but you got used to it. Like this joke. A man walks past a line and asks, "What's for sale?" The guy in front says, "Nothing." The man replies, "Well, that's enough for me," and joins the line. In the end, lines weren't just about stuff. They were about survival, about making sure you had food on the table, shoes on your feet, and soap in the bathroom. They were also about hope. Even if that hope was just for a better cut of cheese or a can of peaches you hadn't seen in years. So next time you're annoyed about a 10-minute wait at the coffee shop, just picture this. You're in a snowy street in Leningrad, bundled up like a walking mattress, waiting 2 hours for canned fish, and you're grateful because they didn't run out before your turn. Welcome to Soviet shopping. Food, gray, greasy, and sometimes missing. Right, comrade, you survived the line. You got a loaf of bread, maybe a few potatoes, and a can of something that might be fish, or fruit. Or possibly glue. Time to head home and make dinner. Soviet-style. Now, food in the USSR was a bit of a gamble. Sometimes delicious, sometimes depressing, and quite often just plain missing. Let's start with the basics. Most Soviet meals began with bread. Black bread, rye bread, dry bread, or on a good day, white bread. You didn't eat bread with food. Bread was the food. It was your spoon, your napkin, your backup plan when there was no meat. Next up, soup. Soup was the backbone of Soviet survival. Cold outside, soup. Sick, soup. No money. Still soup. The most famous one. Borscht. A deep red beet soup, usually with potatoes, cabbage, carrots, maybe a little meat if you were lucky, topped with a dollop of sour cream, eaten with, you guessed it, bread. Other soups included solyanka meat and pickle soup, she cabbage soup, and the mysterious okroshka, which was cold, had radishes, and used kvass fizzy, fermented. Bread drink as the broth. Yes, cold soup with soda bread juice. It's an acquired taste, moving on to the main course. If there was one, meat was hit or miss, usually missing. If you got meat, it was probably something like kotleti, ground meat patties that were mostly breadcrumbs, boiled chicken, bland, gray, and watery liver, tough, dry, and suspicious or mystery sausages, which came in 3 colors, pink, paler pink, and possibly gray. Variety came with potatoes, mashed, boiled, fried, or just existing. They were cheap, filling, and grew everywhere. On the side, you might find pickled cucumbers, pickled tomatoes, pickled cabbage, or pickled everything, really because pickling was how you turned sad vegetables into slightly less sad vegetables that could survive winter. Now let's talk about salads. Soviet salads were a whole universe of their own. They were cold, they were mushy, they were drenched in mayonnaise. The most iconic, Olivier salad, chopped potatoes, carrots, pickles, peas, sometimes ham or bologna, all held together by a mountain of mayo. Herring under a fur coat, layers of beets, onions, mayonnaise, and herring, like a seafood lasagna, but angrier. Vinaigrette, boiled beets, potatoes, pickles, and beans. Not bad, actually. Mayonnaise wasn't just a condiment, it was a core food group. And what about dessert? Well, sugar was rationed sometimes, so you got creative. If you had flour, sugar, and time, you could make a cake. If not, you made do with halva, wafer cookies, or a slice of stale bread. With jam. Tea was essential, always strong, always served with a sugar cube or 2. If you didn't have sweets, you just held the sugar in your mouth and sipped the tea. Old school Soviet trick. Coffee, rare, expensive, usually replaced by chicory, which looks like coffee, smells like coffee. And tastes like roasted sadness. Now, let's talk groceries. You went to state-run stores called Gastronom or Produktovi. They had shelves. Sometimes even things on the shelves. What you could buy depended on the city you lived in. The store managers moved the day of the week whether or not you knew someone behind the counter. Most of the time, stores had the same basic items: canned fish, especially sprats, tinned peas, buckwheat, cabbage, bread, mystery meat in jars. For anything better, you needed blat, that magical word again, meaning a connection. If your cousin worked in a grocery warehouse, maybe you got cheese once a month, or a banana, or the holy grail, real butter, if not margarine and hope. Some people grew their own food at their dacha, a little country cottage with a garden patch. Every weekend, they'd go dig up potatoes, harvest cucumbers, and haul it all back to the city in giant sacks. No one went hungry if they had a dacha. Tired? Yes. Sunburned? Also yes, but hungry? Nope. The real magic happened during holidays. For New Year's or Victory Day, families pulled out all the stops. They saved food for weeks, traded with neighbors, borrowed ingredients, and somehow, through the miracle of Soviet resilience, created tables full of dishes: boiled eggs with caviar, fake or real, fried chicken legs, Olivier salad in a bowl the size of a small bathtub, a bottle of Sovietskoye Champanskoye, Soviet champagne that popped, fizzed, and tasted vaguely like sparkling vinegar. And of course, cake. Even if it was dry, even if it was lopsided, it was cake. And that meant something. Food in the USSR wasn't about taste or variety. It was about resourcefulness, patience, and sometimes a bit of luck. People learned to make do. They used every scrap, saved everything, passed down recipes that worked without eggs, or butter, or sugar. Grandmothers knew how to turn sadness into soup. And despite the shortages, despite the gray stores, and the lines, and the canned meat with no expiration date, people still gathered around tables. They still celebrated. They still found joy in the clink of tea glasses, the crackle of bread crust, and the first spoonful of hot borscht on a freezing winter night, because food wasn't just fuel. It was comfort, a small piece of peace in a system that didn't always make sense. So, now that you've had your fill of beets, bread, and mystery mayo. Let's kick back and digest. TV, music, and secret El Viso. You finished your Soviet dinner, a heroic plate of boiled potatoes, cabbage soup, and a side of suspicious sausage. Time to relax. You walk into the living room, plop down on the couch, that's a bit too firm, and reach for your evening entertainment, which means the TV. Yes, Soviet television. One channel. Maybe two, if you're lucky, and only a few hours of programming per day. No remote control. Just a chunky dial that goes clunk clunk clunk. Even though there's almost nothing to scroll through. The screen is small, the picture is fuzzy, and everything is in glorious black and white until color TV arrives in the 70s. But even then, color was more of a suggestion. So what were people watching? Well, first up, there were a lot of educational shows, science programs, historical documentaries, long, slow lectures by old men in suits talking about agriculture or steel production. No ads, no game shows, just a lot of serious eyebrows and chalkboards. Then there was the news. Vremya. Every evening, a familiar voice came on with a very serious tone, reading out what the party wanted you to know. Grain harvests are going well. The West is collapsing. Comrade Leonid Brezhnev went to another parade and looked pleased. Sports. Yes, but not too much. Cartoons? Also yes, and surprisingly good ones, like New Pagodi, which was kind of like a Soviet Bugs Bunny versus Wile E. Coyote, except it was a wolf chasing a rabbit, and it had some surprisingly funky jazz in the background. There was also the New Year's variety show. A huge deal. Glitter. Singing. Comedy skits. People in evening gowns. The whole country would gather to watch it. Kind of like a cross between a holiday concert and a Soviet Oscars ceremony. And let's not forget the beloved irony of fate. A romantic comedy played every New Year's Eve about a man who gets drunk, flies to the wrong city, walks into someone else's identical apartment, and accidentally falls in love. Sounds strange. It was, but people adored it. Still do. But here's the thing. TV wasn't very exciting. Not compared to what people knew was out there, beyond the Iron Curtain. Because yes, even in the USSR, Western music and movies found a way in. Not officially, of course. Officially, Western pop culture was decadent, corrupt, and full of capitalist poison. But unofficially, people were listening to Elvis, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, and ABBA behind closed doors. How? Well, there were a few sneaky tricks. The most famous one, Bone Records. In the 1950s and 60s, young Soviet music lovers started making illegal copies of banned Western music by pressing the recordings onto old X-ray film. Yes, actual human X-rays. If you were cool, you might have a bootleg Beatles album on someone's ribcage, or a jazz record imprinted on a spinal cord. They were called ribs or music on bones, and they were forbidden, but incredibly popular. You find them passed around in underground markets, whispered about in stairwells, shared in secret listening parties. The sound quality, terrible. The vibes, immaculate. There were also reel-to-reel tape recorders. If you had one of those, you were basically a local DJ. People would come over, bring blank tapes, and copy albums, Western rock, jazz, French pop, even disco, especially disco. And if you had a cousin abroad, jackpot. They might mail you a real vinyl record, smuggled inside a care package of jeans, chocolate, and forbidden streams. Of course, the government didn't love this. There were raids, arrests, confiscated radios. But the cat was out of the bag, and it was wearing bell-bottoms. What about Soviet music? Oh, there was plenty, and some of it was really good. There were official state-approved artists like Alla Pugacheva, the queen of Soviet pop, with her big hair and bigger voice, and Vladimir Vysotsky, the gravel-voiced poet who sang about war, prison, and the human soul, raw, real, and beloved by millions. There was also barred music, just a man, a guitar, and a ton of feelings. These songs were passed around by hand, recorded in kitchens, and played on loop at gatherings. They weren't flashy, but they hit people deep. And let's not forget classical music and ballet. Those were the pride of the Soviet Union. The Bolshoi Ballet was world famous. Young dancers trained for years to perform in Swan Lake and the Nutcracker, and they were treated like royalty as long as they behaved. Theaters were packed, tickets were hard to get, and even ordinary families tuned in when classical performances were broadcast on TV. Culture was a big deal. Still, despite all the official culture, the operas, the poets, the symphonies, people craved the forbidden stuff. You weren't supposed to love Western music. So naturally, people did. People would record foreign radio broadcasts from places like Radio Free Europe or the BBC World Service. You had to be sneaky and patient because the Soviet government jammed the signals. But with a good antenna and a quiet room, you could catch a scratchy broadcast of the Rolling Stones and feel like you were hearing a message from another planet. Movies were a whole other story. Soviet films were often artistic and meaningful. Lots of symbolism, emotional stares, and slow pacing. Think people staring into the distance while snow falls dramatically. Some were brilliant, others less so. But foreign movies, now those were gold. You could find dubbed versions of Rambo, Rocky, Terminator, even Star Wars, passed around on grainy VHS tapes. The dubs were often done by one guy with a flat voice narrating over the original lines. You'd hear, he says, "I'll be back," but people didn't care. They loved it. It wasn't just about the action or the cool special effects. It was about seeing something different, colorful, fast-paced, a window into another world, even if that window was covered in static. So, what was Soviet entertainment like? Well, it was a mix. Part poetry, part propaganda, part ballet, part bootleg rock concert, sometimes boring, sometimes brilliant, but always part of the rhythm of daily life, because even in a place where the state tried to control every story, people found ways to tell their own. And now, dear listener, It's time to turn down the volume and get cozy. In the next chapter, we'll look at Soviet housing, where families lived, slept, cooked, argued, and somehow made it work with one bathroom and for generations under one roof. Spoiler, it's about to get cramped. Apartments, roommates, and the great Soviet shower queued right. You finished your mystery meat cutlet and just finished watching a rerun of Swan Lake or the New Year's special. Again. Now it's time to retreat to your humble Soviet dwelling, but don't expect a quiet evening with your own room and a private bathroom. Oh no. Welcome to the Soviet apartment experience. Let's begin with the basics. Housing was tight. After the chaos of World War II and decades of rapid industrialization, cities were bursting at the seams. Millions of people needed homes. Fast. So the Soviet Union built ... well. A lot of concrete. Enter the Khrushchevka, those famous low-rise apartment blocks that popped up everywhere in the 60s and 70s, named after Nikita Khrushchev. These buildings were designed to be simple, fast to build, and very, very functional. Each apartment was small, and I mean small. Think a kitchen the size of a walk-in closet, a living room that doubled as a bedroom, and walls so thin you could hear your neighbor sneeze. And also what they were having for dinner. The joke went, in the morning, you smell the neighbors. Breakfast. At lunch, you hear their argument. By dinner, you're emotionally involved. Now, most Soviet families didn't get an apartment all to themselves. In fact, many people lived in communal apartments, known as kommunalkas, especially in the older cities. Imagine this, you live in one room, not an apartment, one room, the kitchen, bathroom, and hallway, shared with 2, 3, or even 10 other families. Each family had a spot in the fridge, a shelf for pots and pans, and a strict system for taking turns with the stove. Labels were everywhere. Touching someone else's butter was basically an act of war. The bathroom, a queue. Always, you had to schedule your shower. There were entire calendars pinned to the wall. Sergey, Tuesday, 7:30 a.m. Babushka, Wednesday, 9 p.m. And nobody touched the hot water pipe, or it'll explode. And forget about long, luxurious soaks in the tub. If the water was hot, which wasn't guaranteed, you made it quick. Also, no water heaters in most apartments. If it was summer and the central system shut off for maintenance, which it often did, you'd boil water in kettles and pour it into a basin for a makeshift bath. And remember, privacy. What privacy? Walls were thin, doors creaked, neighbors were nosy. Everyone knew everything. Did your uncle drink too much? Did your teenage daughter bring home a boyfriend? Did you say something slightly suspicious about the government? Don't worry. Your neighbor already knows, and might have reported it to the district committee, just in case. But hey, it wasn't all bad. Living in such tight quarters had its upside. You always had someone to borrow salt from, or tea, or a screwdriver, or a sympathetic ear after a long shift at the factory. Communal living created a kind of forced togetherness. People shared meals, celebrated birthdays, watched each other's kids, argued, made up, borrowed too much sugar, argued again. It was like an ongoing soap opera with real people and cabbage. Let's talk about furniture. Soviet apartments were sparsely decorated but cozy in their own way. A typical setup. One big couch that folded out into a bed, a tall cabinet with glass doors full of fancy plates. No one ever used a wall unit, a kind of multi-purpose storage monster that held books, records, liquor, toys, and maybe a stuffed bear, a TV on. A rolling cart and rugs. Rugs everywhere. On the floor, on the wall, on the back of the couch. Soviet rugs were like pets, always there, always shedding. People took pride in their spaces. Even the tiniest apartment was scrubbed, organized, and decorated with love. Doilies on everything. Potted plants on the windowsill, a painting of a lake, maybe a portrait of Lenin, or a dog playing chess. Now, let's visit the kitchen, the heart of the home. Every square inch mattered. There was usually a tiny fridge, a gas stove, a single sink, and one or two chairs squeezed around a small folding table. And this is where the magic happened. Over endless cups of black tea and bowls of sunflower seeds, people gossiped, dreamed, plotted, and complained about work, food shortages, and the neighbors' loud accordion playing. Kitchens were also political. You didn't talk freely at the factory, but at 11 p.m., with a cigarette in hand and the curtains closed, that's when people whispered about politics, shared banned poems, or discussed rumors they'd heard on foreign radio. It was called the kitchen intelligentsia, a whole culture of quiet rebellion ... over a chipped enamel teacup. Now, 1. Fun detail: elevators. If you lived in a taller building, you probably had one. But it was small, very small. It groaned, it stalled, it smelled a little like boiled cabbage. And if you were unlucky, you had to climb 10 flights of stairs because it was out of order again. Laundry. Done in the bathtub. Drying. Done on the balcony or a long line strung across the room. Nothing like the sight of Grandma's underpants, swaying gently between the television and the dinner table. Of course, as the years went on, things improved. More families got private apartments. High-rise buildings filled the city skylines. Bathrooms became less communal, and kitchens got microwaves, if you were lucky. But even then, the spirit of shared living remained. Friends still dropped by, unannounced. Neighbors still kept score over borrowed sugar. And Grandma still warned you not to stand near a drafty window or you'd catch a cold, because science so. What was Soviet housing like? It was tight. It was loud. It smelled like onions and floor polish. And somehow, it worked, because when you live in close quarters with your whole family, your neighbors, and your neighbor's parrot, you learn to be patient, you learn to adapt, and you become really, really good at sharing one bathroom with 5 people. The Soviet workday, coffee, typewriters, and collective spirit. It's early morning in the Soviet Union. The sky is gray, the hallway is cold, and someone's already using the bathroom. You shuffle to the kitchen in your slippers, boil water on the gas stove, and sip tea from a glass in a metal holder, because mugs are for Westerners. You eat a quick breakfast of buttered bread and maybe a boiled egg, and then it's time to head to work. Welcome to the Soviet workday. Whether you were a teacher, a factory worker, an engineer, a street cleaner, or a bureaucrat with a love for stamps, your day started early and ended with a full dose of collective spirit. Let's start with the basics. In the Soviet Union, everyone worked. Unless you were very young, very old, or ill, you had a job. In fact, not having a job was suspicious. It could even be a crime, parasitism. They called it. Jobs were assigned by the state. You didn't choose your dream career based on passion or salary. Instead, you graduated from school or university, and the government told you where to go. Congratulations, you're now an electrical engineer. Please report to the hydroelectric plant in Siberia. But hey, job security was basically guaranteed. You couldn't really get fired. Your boss might yell, your coworkers might grumble, but you weren't going anywhere unless you seriously messed up or tried to defect to Finland. Let's say you worked in an office. You'd arrive around 8 or 9 a.m., coat dusted with snow, carrying your briefcase and a small bag with a sandwich. You'd hang up your heavy winter coat in a communal closet, say hello to your coworkers, and settle in behind a wooden desk with a typewriter that sounded like a miniature tank. The office was likely dimly lit, the walls covered with posters of tractors or smiling workers holding wheat. There were potted plants in the corners, usually struggling ferns, and a lingering smell of old paper. Instant coffee and cheap cologne. Coffee wasn't great. You might have instant coffee crystals from a tin, stirred into hot water until it looked vaguely drinkable, or just tea, strong, black tea, in a glass with a teaspoon left inside, because why bother taking it out? If you were lucky, your workplace had a samovar, a giant tea urn that kept hot water ready all day. The office might also have a radio quietly humming in the background, playing folk music or patriotic news bulletins. And what did people actually do all day? Well, in a factory, there was real work, assembling machinery, fixing parts, welding, stamping, and making sure the quota was met. In a school, teachers scribbled on chalkboards and tried to keep students awake while explaining the heroic poetry of the Revolution. In offices, well, things were sometimes a little more relaxed. There were meetings, many meetings. Some were real, others were more about nodding, agreeing, and writing things down that no one would read. Paperwork was life. Forms, reports, more forms. Everything had to be signed, stamped, reviewed, and filed in a metal cabinet. If you liked bureaucracy, the Soviet Union was basically Disneyland. Of course, every workplace had its characters. There was the office babushka, a woman in her 50s or 60s who knew everything, remembered everyone's birthday, and had a permanent stash of hard candies and judgmental looks. There was the quiet guy in the back who may or may not have been a KGB informant. There was the comedian who always had a new joke about Brezhnev's eyebrows quietly told, of course. And there was always one person who somehow did nothing all day, but was still considered essential. And then there was the Wall of Honor, a bulletin board with photos of model workers, slogans like "Labor is Glory," and motivational posters featuring bold fonts and heroic mustaches. Now, once or twice a week, you might have to attend a political meeting. These weren't optional. Workers gathered in the break room or assembly hall, listen to a party representative, talk about production goals, world affairs, or ideological purity, and maybe chanted a few slogans. You clapped, nodded, and hoped it wouldn't run into lunch. Lunch. The cafeteria, or stolovaya, was its own unique world. You'd grab a tray, shuffle through the line, and be handed something warm and mysterious, a bowl of cabbage soup, plate of stewed meat with kasha, a square of jiggly jello. There was almost always black bread and compote, a sweet drink made from boiled fruit, and everyone had the same food. No gluten-free options, no decaf milk lattes, just Soviet staples served with ladles and love. After lunch, it was back to work, or, depending on the place, a brief nap. Yes, some factories actually had nap rooms, efficiency through sleep. The rest of the afternoon might include phone calls, more typing, more walking down the hall to deliver a form in person because the fax machine didn't exist yet. If something broke, you fixed it, or didn't. There was a phrase for that. They pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. But despite the red tape and the lack of fancy coffee machines, many people took pride in one that they did. Being a good worker was a big deal. There were awards, medals, and even bonus rations for being an exemplary laborer. You might get your name in the local newspaper, or a handshake from the director, or a certificate to hang next to your family photos. And when the workday ended, around 5 or 6 p.m., you grabbed your coat, picked up a loaf of bread from the store, and headed home, back to your Khrushchevka, ready to do it all again tomorrow. Some people also worked second jobs, cleaning, tutoring, repairing radios, especially if they had a large family. Others went to evening school, or stayed late organizing events, or rehearsing for the workplace choir. Yes, many offices had choirs and drama clubs and volleyball teams. Because in the USSR, work wasn't just about the job. It was about belonging, being part of a group, a brigade, a team. You didn't just clock in and clock out. You participated in Soviet life. So, was it glamorous? Not really. But it had rhythm, it had structure, it had routine, which can be strangely comforting, especially in a world full of lines, shortages, and political speeches. In the end, Soviet workers didn't have much luxury, but they had purpose and a lot of stories to tell over tea and sardines at the end of the day. Now, dear listener, fluff your pillow and rest your tired, typewriting hands. In the next chapter, we'll explore love, marriage, and dating, Soviet style. Spoiler, it involves a lot of awkward parties, shared apartments, and possibly a grandmother in the next room. Love, marriage, and your mother-in-law sleeps on the couch. All right, comrade, you've worked your shift at the factory, survived the long line for bread, and finally got a seat on the trolley bus without someone's elbow in your ribs. Now it's time to talk about something more tender. Love. Soviet style. Let's get one thing straight. Romance existed in the USSR. It just looked a little different. There were no dating apps, no swiping, no situationships, and definitely no candlelit dinners at a sushi place followed by a moody indie film. Instead, love began where everything else did, at work, or in school, or be in the queue for potatoes. Nothing says destiny like reaching for the same bruised apple at the same time. Most couples met through friend groups, pioneer camps, or komsomol events, basically youth group meetups, but with more speeches about Lenin and fewer s'mores. And first dates. Well, forget fancy restaurants. If a young man had a few rubles, maybe they'd go to the movies. Usually a Soviet film about tractor production or a very serious romance that ended with someone moving to Siberia for ideological reasons. If not the movies, then a walk. Walks were a big deal. You'd stroll through the park, share sunflower seeds, maybe sit on a cold bench and talk about your dreams, or what you'd do if you ever saw the Black Sea. And yes, flowers were still important. You always gave an odd number, because even numbers were for funerals. No pressure. Now let's say things go well. You've been walking together, exchanging glances, and maybe even shared a dance at the factory New Year's party. Time to talk about marriage. In the Soviet Union, people didn't date for years and years. No one said, we're just seeing how it goes. Nope, you dated, then you got married, quickly. Why? Because housing was tight, and getting married meant you might finally get your own room, or, if you were very lucky, your own apartment. Marriage was also tied to a lot of practical benefits: better access to housing, higher position on the apartment waiting list, possibility of a loan, and the joy of not living with your parents forever. Though sometimes you still did, weddings were both modest and loud. A basic wedding went like this. First, The couple would register their marriage at the ZAGS, the Civil Registry Office. There was a short ceremony, some official stamps, and boom, you were legally married. After that, the party began. There was food, lots of it. Homemade salads with mayo, pickled everything, sliced meats, and giant loaves of bread. There was cake, of course, sometimes shaped like a tower or a weird swan. The wedding dress, white and puffy if you could get one, sometimes borrowed, sometimes sewn by a friend, and often reused multiple times in the family. One dress, 5 brides. The groom wore a suit, or something that kind of looked like a suit, tie optional, mustache and courage. Music came from an accordion, a cassette player, or that one uncle who brought his guitar everywhere. And the party, oh, it could go on for hours. Toasts, jokes, dancing, speeches from coworkers, more toasts. And, yes, vodka, many, many toasts, each one ending with Zalibov to love. Now let's talk about married life. Let's say the happy couple is now wed. Where do they go? Well, usually not far. Most young couples moved in with one of their parents. If they were lucky, they got a room in the family apartment. If they were very lucky, they got a one-bedroom Khrushchevka to themselves. But chances are, someone's mother was sleeping on the couch. Soviet housing, wasn't built for privacy. Many families lived with in-laws, siblings, and even ex-spouses, because there simply wasn't anywhere else to go. So newlyweds learned to be romantic very quietly. They whispered sweet nothings, while babushka snored 2 meters away. They argued about whose turn it was to wash the dishes, while the cousin practiced violin in the hallway. Still, love endured. People found ways to create space. Maybe they rearranged the furniture. Maybe they hung a curtain in the room. Maybe they went for another walk. And what about kids? Well, most couples had children pretty quickly because despite all the challenges, raising a family was encouraged, and the state offered incentives. Paid maternity leave, free child care, preschool starting as early as age 1, monthly baby benefits, and food rations. Babies were usually wrapped like little burritos in layers of cloth and wool. Strollers were big, clunky, and could survive a snowstorm. Parents bundled their kids like mini astronauts. Scarves, boots, and layers upon layers of knitwear. Raising kids in the Soviet Union was a mix of community and chaos. You had help. Lots of it. Grandparents were often full-time babysitters. Neighbors kept an eye out, and schools. They were free, and included music, chess, athletics, and ideological education. But parenting came with rules. Too much Western influence. Suspicious, too loud at the playground. Someone would report it. Too lenient. Well, the party didn't love that either. Still, families made it work. They celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes and plastic balloons. They spent summers at the dacha, letting kids run wild and eat unwashed apples. They made scrapbooks, knit matching sweaters, and sang lullabies about tractors and peace. And romance never really disappeared, even after years of living in tight quarters, sharing the kitchen with your in-laws, and surviving a national shortage of pantyhose. Couples still found little ways to show affection: a handwritten note, a single flower, a bar of chocolate, bought after standing in line for 2 hours. That was love. Soviet style. So, was marriage easy in the USSR? Nope, but it was real, messy, loud, occasionally cabbage-scented, but also full of shared struggle, teamwork, and quiet moments in the middle of the noise. And yes, sometimes your mother-in-law did sleep on the couch. That was just part of the deal. So rest easy tonight. Dear listener, in our next chapter, we'll dig into education, from kindergarten finger painting to university physics, and all the chalk dust in between. Sharpen your pencils. School is about to start. From kindergarten to commissars, going to school in the usro right. Young comrade, time to pack your bag, button up your coat, and make sure your hair is neatly combed. Today, we're heading to school. Soviet-style education in the USSR wasn't just about learning math and grammar. It was about shaping the ideal citizen, loyal, hard-working, and preferably good at quoting Lenin. Let's start at the very beginning, kindergarten. Soviet kids often started preschool as early as age 1, 1 year old. These weren't just daycares. They were structured institutions, with nap times, meals, songs, and plenty of supervision. Every morning, parents dropped off their sleepy toddlers at big buildings filled with coat racks, tiny chairs, and the faint smell of semolina porridge. The day started with group gymnastics. Tiny humans in leotards doing arm circles while a cassette tape played cheerful music. Then came learning games, outdoor play, snack time, and, of course, ideological education. Even 5-year-olds learned about Lenin. You know, just the basics. Be nice, share your toys, and if you see someone behaving suspiciously, tell the teacher. When kids turned 7, it was time for real school, the beginning of a long, structured, and sometimes cabbage-scented educational journey. The first day of school was a big deal. Children wore their best clothes. Girls had white bows in their hair the size of dinner plates. Boys had fresh haircuts and shiny shoes. Each child brought a bouquet of flowers, not for a classmate, but for the teacher, because in the USSR, teachers were deeply respected. Also slyly feared. Classrooms were organized, quiet, and filled with portraits of Soviet leaders, Lenin, Marx, sometimes Gagarin for fun. There were red banners on the wall and motivational slogans like, "Study well, work better, live for the motherland." Pretty inspiring stuff when you're 7 years old and just trying to remember how to hold a pencil. The school day began with a bell, and not a friendly ding-dong, but a loud, metallic clang. Students stood up when the teacher entered, said hello in unison, and then the lessons began. So what did Soviet kids study? Everything, and then some. Russian language and literature heavy on Pushkin and Tolstoy, mathematics strong enough to terrify Western school systems, history with some selective editing, geography, science, and nature drawing, music, and physical education, and also Marxist-Leninist philosophy, starting in later grades. Most schools ran from morning till early afternoon, but don't think kids just went home and played. There was homework, always homework, and if your grades slipped, well, your parents were getting a very official phone call. Now, let's talk about the uniforms. All Soviet school children wore the same outfit. For girls, a brown dress with a black apron, and white tights if it wasn't too cold. For boys, a white shirt, dark pants, and a belt that never quite fit right. On holidays, girls wore a white apron instead, kind of like battle dress for festive occasions. Everyone also had to wear their pioneer scarf, a bright red triangle tied around the neck. More on that in a moment. Now, schools were strict. If you were late, you stood in the hallway. If you talked too much, your name went on the discipline board. And if you forgot your homework 3 times in a row, you got the dreaded call to the principal's office. Still, school wasn't all grim. There were field trips to museums, class concerts where kids played recorders in unison, and school-wide clean-up days, where students help sweep the yard and wipe windows, because nothing builds character like cleaning a statue of Lenin. Let's take a moment to talk about the pioneers. The young pioneers were sort of like the Soviet version of the Boy Scouts. If the Boy Scouts were run by the Communist Party and had a lot more lectures, kids joined around age 9. You wore a white shirt, red scarf, and a small pin with Lenin's face on it. You swore an oath to be a good citizen, help others, and love your country. And you definitely practiced marching in a straight line for school events. Pioneers did volunteer work, sang songs, helped organize school plays, and learned how to build fires because survival skills are important, especially in Siberia. Later, if you were serious about school and good at following the rules, you could join the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League for Teens. This looked great on university applications and made you look super responsible at parties. Now, back to the classroom. Teachers were respected, but also overworked. They had to manage large classes, strict state-approved textbooks, and sometimes a broken heater in the middle of January. Still, many of them loved teaching. They cared about their students. They worked long hours, graded homework by hand, and even visited students' homes if something seemed wrong. They also had to attend political meetings and report on student behavior, especially if someone was reading suspicious books or listening to Western rock music. By the time kids reached secondary school, they had to start thinking seriously about their future. Some went on to technical schools, learning trades like carpentry, mechanics, or nursing. Others prepared for university, where things got even more competitive. To get into university, you needed good grades, glowing references, and often, the right connections. Entrance exams were tough, and once you were in, you'd study full-time, live in a dormitory, and maybe join a student brigade to help build a factory over the summer, because vacations were for labor. Obviously, university life was a mix of intense study, shared rooms, boiled potatoes, and occasionally sneaking out to see a band movie if you had a friend with a VCR. And let's not forget the cultural education. Soviet students were expected to know classical music, be able to recite poetry, and definitely recognize the works of Chekhov, Gorky, and a dozen socialist realists you've never heard of. It wasn't just about making good workers. It was about making well-rounded, morally upright, properly ideological citizens. So was school in the USSR fun sometimes, but mostly it was strict, structured, and serious. You learned a lot. You memorized poems, you sang anthems, you stood straight when the teacher walked in, and by the time you graduated, you knew exactly how to pass an exam, clean a chalkboard, and fold a red scarf with military precision. But you also made friends for life, shared sandwiches, snuck notes in class, laughed quietly during assemblies, and maybe even fell in love behind the chemistry lab. So now, comrade, lay your little red scarf to rest and drift off. In our next chapter, we'll visit the Soviet healthcare system where you didn't pay a dime, but you might need to bring your own bandages, sleep tight, doctor's orders, going to the doctor, Soviet healthcare, free and frequently confusing. Comrade, lie back, take a deep breath, and say because tonight we're paying a visit to the Soviet healthcare system where medical care was free. But your diagnosis might depend on whether your doctor had enough gauze. So let's start with the basics. Yes, Soviet health care was free, completely. No insurance, no bills, no surprise charges. You could walk into a clinic, see a doctor, and get treated without paying a kopeck, which, on paper, sounds like a dream. And in many ways, It was a remarkable achievement, the idea that health was a human right, not a luxury. The Soviet Union invested in building hospitals and clinics across even the most remote regions. Even tiny villages had a feldsher, a sort of medical assistant who could stitch a wound, give injections, and maybe even deliver a baby if needed. But of course, things weren't perfect. Let's walk through what a typical Soviet medical experience looked like. You wake up feeling terrible. You've got a fever, a cough, and your head feels like it's full of mashed potatoes. What do? First, you call your workplace and let them know you're going to the polyclinic, the all-purpose neighborhood health center. Next, you head outside and wait in line. Because in the USSR, there were always lines, even for your health. At the polyclinic, you check in with the receptionist, who writes your name down in a massive logbook. No computers, just paper, stamps, and a lot of blue ink. Then you wait, and wait, and wait. Eventually, you're called in to see the therapist, not the mental health kind, but your general practitioner. They examine you with a stethoscope that's seen better decades, ask a few brisk questions, and write everything down in your medical booklet, a little cardboard folder you bring to every appointment, filled with mysterious notes and incomprehensible handwriting. If you need more care, they refer you to a specialist, a neurologist if your back hurts, an otolaryngologist, the ENT if your ears won't stop ringing, or maybe the dermatologist, who has exactly 3 creams and 1 opinion most. Doctors were well trained and knew their stuff. Soviet medical education was strict and thorough, but they often worked in tough conditions. Outdated equipment, low pay, and a severe lack of basic supplies. So yes, sometimes you had to bring your own bandages, or syringes, or medicine, or even light bulbs for the hospital room. You'd also see some creative solutions, reusing gloves, sterilizing tools with vodka, and treating everything from anxiety to allergies with a mysterious mustard plaster. Speaking of which, let's talk about the home remedies. Your average Soviet babushka knew 27 ways to cure a cold using items found in the kitchen. Hot tea with raspberry jam, inhaling boiled potatoes, rubbing vodka on your chest, wearing wet socks, yes, really, and of course, cupping therapy, which made your back look like you wrestled an octopus. Was it all effective? Not always, but it showed how resourceful people were when access to medicine was limited. Now, what if things got serious? Let's say your appendix burst or you broke your leg. Off to the hospital you go. Hospitals were free, but let's not pretend they were luxurious. Most were clean but Spartan. White walls, no frills beds, shared rooms, and food that tasted like it had lost a bet. Nurses wore stiff uniforms and moved like they were on a tight schedule, which they were. There weren't enough of them, and they worked long hours for very little pay. Patients brought their own pajamas, towels, soap, dishes, toilet paper. Basically anything that wasn't nailed down. Family members played a big role in care. They delivered home-cooked food, smuggled in clean sheets, and sometimes even stayed overnight in a chair if you needed extra help. Still, the system worked. In its own way, doctors were respected, if underpaid. Medical care was accessible, if inconsistent, and there was a real effort to care for everyone, not just the wealthy or privileged. Now let's talk about mental health, or rather, the lack of it. The Soviet Union wasn't exactly known for open conversations about depression or anxiety. In fact, showing too many negative emotions could be seen as ideologically suspicious. You were expected to be optimistic, strong, and loyal to the cause. If you weren't, well, maybe something was wrong with you, And unfortunately, in some cases, political dissent was labeled as psychiatric illness. People who criticized the state were sometimes diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia and sent to psychiatric hospitals, not to get better, but to disappear. That dark side aside, there were also genuine efforts to help people with mental health issues. There were psychiatric clinics, sanatoriums, and rest homes where patients could recover in a calm setting, often by the sea, surrounded by trees and heavy supervision. Let's shift gears. What about dentists? Soviet dentistry, the stuff of childhood nightmares. Yes, it was free, but anesthesia wasn't always guaranteed. If you had a cavity, chances are you knew it, and everyone else heard you getting it drilled. And dental aesthetics. Let's just say a lot of Soviet adults rocked gold teeth like they were treasure chests. It wasn't just fashion, it was practical. Gold didn't corrode, and sometimes it was literally the only material available. Now, in terms of preventive care, the Soviet system actually did pretty well. There were regular checkups at schools and factories. Mobile clinics came to villages. Children received vaccines on a strict schedule. And health posters everywhere reminded people to wash their hands, eat their carrots, and never, ever go outside with wet hair in summer. Kids went to sanatoriums, kind of like health camps with mineral water, massages, sun therapy, and long walks in sandals. And if you had a chronic condition, you might be sent to a rest home for weeks, a government-paid vacation where the main prescription was fresh air and boiled buckwheat. So overall, how was Soviet healthcare? Reliable, sometimes, efficient, occasionally, free, always, frustrating, often. But despite the shortages and quirks, people were cared for. And for many, that safety net, knowing a doctor would see you whether or not you had money, made all the difference. Cooking with nothing, what Soviets ate and how they made it taste like something right. Sleepy comrade, time to step into a Soviet kitchen. Take a seat at the tiny table, admire the floral oilcloth, and listen closely as the kettle starts to whistle. Tonight, we're talking about food. And not the food you'd find on a restaurant menu. We're talking real, everyday Soviet food, the stuff people actually ate, cooked, and occasionally lined up for in the freezing cold. Let's start with the big idea. Food in the Soviet Union wasn't about choice. It was about survival. With a little creativity, the Soviet diet was shaped by three things: central planning, chronic shortages, and the unstoppable power of the home cook, especially babushkas, who could turn a potato into 5 meals and a snack. Let's begin with the rationing days. Back in the 1920s and 30s, and again during and after World War II, food was distributed by ration cards. Families received small booklets with coupons for bread, sugar, meat, and other essentials, but even with rations, food was often scarce. So people got used to making do with less. This is where the Soviet tradition of stretching ingredients was born. A little meat, add grains. No meat, use mushrooms. No mushrooms, well, maybe cabbage will do. But let's fast forward to the post-war decades, when rationing officially ended and a more stable, though still unpredictable, food system developed. So, what was on the Soviet menu? Bread. Glorious bread. Bread was the foundation of every meal. Black bread, white bread, rye bread, often dense, slightly sour, and served with everything. It was cheap, filling, and perfect for dipping into soup or spreading with whatever you could find in the fridge. Which brings us to the fridge itself. Most Soviet kitchens had a small, loud refrigerator, sometimes held shut with a piece of string. Inside, you might find a suspicious half-jar of pickles, a carton of kefir fermented milk, kind of like drinkable yogurt, a lonely beet, and possibly a mysterious lump of something labeled meat, although no one's quite sure what kind. But even with limited supplies, people cooked. They made soups like borscht, beets, cabbage, and whatever else you had, or solyanka, sour, salty soup full of leftovers. They made kasha, porridge, made from buckwheat, millet, or semolina. They made pelmeni, meat dumplings that could be stored frozen and boiled in 5 minutes. And of course, they made salads. Now, Soviet salads were a thing of wonder. They weren't leafy. They were hearty, chunky, and often held together with mayo. The crown jewel. Olivier salad. A Soviet potato salad. It had boiled potatoes, pickles, peas, carrots, eggs, mystery meat or bologna, and a generous scoop of mayonnaise served cold. Always cold. It was the star of every holiday table, and probably still lives on in your grandma's fridge. Other favorites included herring under a fur coat, layers of beets, herring, and mayo. Yes, it's real vinaigrette, a bright beet salad with pickles and sauerkraut, and something called Korean carrot salad, which had absolutely nothing to do with Korea, but added a nice kick. Art of substitution cooking. In the USSR meant improvising. Didn't have lemons? Use vinegar. No sour cream. Maybe yogurt. No onions. Try more dill. Dill was everywhere. Fresh, dried, frozen. It got sprinkled on salads, soups, potatoes, eggs, and probably even toothpaste if no one was looking. And of course, there were condiments. Mayonnaise was king. Sunflower oil was queen, and mustard was, well, intense. Seriously, Soviet mustard could wake the dead. One dab, and your sinuses were cleared for a week. Where did people get their food? This is where things got tricky. You couldn't always count on grocery stores. Shelves were often empty. Basic items like butter, sausage, or oranges would vanish for weeks. So people learned to chase supply rumors. You'd hear whispers on the street, sugar's at store number 5, and suddenly 100 people would line up before the truck even arrived. Lines were a fact of life. If you saw a line, you got in it, even if you didn't know what it was for. Chances are, it was something good. To cope, families built networks. Neighbors called each other. Coworkers traded favors. Everyone had a guy, someone who knew someone who could get cheese. Meanwhile, many families grew their own food. Out in the countryside or in small town plots, people had dakas, little summer cottages with vegetable gardens. They planted potatoes, onions, carrots, cucumbers, tomatoes, whatever they could. In late summer, it was time for preserving. Jars of pickled cabbage, cucumbers, tomatoes, mushrooms, and jam filled every shelf. By winter, your pantry looked like the laboratory of a very Slavic mad scientist. And let's not forget the hunting and foraging. People picked mushrooms in the forest. They caught fish in rivers. Some even had backyard chickens. Eggs were gold. Holiday feasts even with shortages. Soviet families knew how to throw a party. For New Year's Eve, the table groaned under platters of Olivier salad, cold meats, fruit if you could find any, and Soviet champagne, which was more like carbonated apple cider with ambition. There were cakes like Napoleon, made from thin pastry layers with cream, and torts from special bakeries if you had the right connections. For the rest of the year, desserts were simpler. Boiled condensed milk tea, cookies, or some jam, and a spuntia was always there, black, strong, and served in glass mugs with metal holders. Sugar cubes optional. Conversation required. So, was Soviet food good? Surprisingly, yes, if you knew what to do with it. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't fast, but it was resourceful, homey, and made with a lot of care. People knew how to make the most of very little. They shared recipes, passed down tips, and kept a secret stash of chocolate just in case. In many ways, Soviet food was about community. Neighbors trading pickles, grandmothers baking for the whole family, kids bringing home bread from the store like tiny heroes. So now, comrade, imagine the kitchen growing quiet. The kettle has cooled, the dishes are done, and somewhere, a babushka is already thinking about what to cook tomorrow. Red banners and birthday cakes. How Soviets celebrated holidays. All right, comrade, dust off your best suit, shine your boots, and practice your marching posture. Because tonight, we're going to a Soviet celebration. Despite the gray buildings, long lines, and comrade, your paperwork is in complete energy. The Soviet Union knew how to throw a party, especially when it came to holidays. Not always with fireworks or fancy gifts, but with parades, patriotism, and a lot of mayonnaise-based salad. Let's start with the biggest, boldest, most Soviet holiday of them all, May 1st, International Workers' Day. Forget your average spring break. In the USSR, May 1st was a day of massive parades, cheerful banners, and so many red flags you'd think the entire country was in a relationship. It was a day to celebrate workers, labor, and the glory of socialism. Cities organized parades with marching bands, flag-waving children, and even elaborate floats showing off tractors or happy factory workers made from papier mâché. You didn't just watch, you participated. Factories and schools assigned people to march. Everyone wore their best clothes, or uniforms, and held up portraits of Lenin, Marx, and sometimes local party officials who looked slightly uncomfortable after the parade. Time for picnics, ice cream, and a rare afternoon where everyone actually smiled in public. Victory Day. May 9th. This one was deeply emotional. May 9th marked the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. Known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War. It wasn't just a holiday. It was a moment of collective remembrance and pride. Cities held parades. Veterans wore rows of shiny medals, and people gave flowers to old men with canes who had seen too much. Even children understood the seriousness. They recited poems, sang, wore songs, and gave chocolate to grandfathers who'd once survived on dried bread. Families gathered to eat together, raise a glass to fallen relatives, and tell old stories. And yes, every TV channel played black and white war movies. All day, no exceptions. New Year's Eve. The Soviet Christmas shares a fun twist. Christmas wasn't a big deal in the USSR. Religious holidays were downplayed, sometimes even discouraged, but New Year's was the event of the year. Soviets went all out. There was a decorated New Year's tree, basically a Christmas tree without the religious part. There was Ded Moroz grandfather Frost and his sidekick Sneguroshka, a snow maiden who helped deliver presents. Kids left notes for them and woke up to small gifts under the tree. Families made huge meals. We're talking Olivier salad, naturally pickled herring, cold-cut sliced cheese arranged like a flower, and maybe even a store-bought cake if you got lucky at midnight. Everyone toasted with Soviet champagne, a sweet, fizzy drink that probably wasn't technically champagne, but who was checking. Then came the presidential speech, the clock striking 12, and fireworks. Or, if fireworks weren't available, just banging pots and pans on the balcony. Women's Day. March 8th. The Soviet Union had a Women's Day, and it was actually a pretty big deal. March 8th was a day when men bought flowers, kids made cards, and even the most serious communist bosses tried to look charming for a minute. At work, bosses gave women little gifts, like perfume or chocolates, and awkward speeches about how important they were. At home, women still cooked the feast, cleaned the dishes, and wrangled the kids. But they did it while holding a fresh bouquet of tulips and trying not to roll their eyes. Still, it was a sweet day. Not romantic like Valentine's, but more about saying thank you, Comrade Mama. Other Soviet holidays there were a lot of official holidays. Like November 7th, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Lots of speeches, lots of flags, not much cake. Cosmonautics Day, April 12th, celebrating Yuri Gagarin's flight into space. Kids made rockets out of cardboard. Knowledge Day, September 1st, not a real holiday, but the official start of the school year. Kids wore uniforms and gave flowers to teachers. Parents cried a little, and then there were subtle holidays, like Lenin's birthday or the founding of this or that factory, where workers were invited to attend voluntary celebrations that felt slightly mandatory. Birthdays and personal celebrations. Let's talk about birthdays. Birthday parties were a big deal, especially for kids. Families decorated the apartment, put together a feast, and invited all the relatives. Sometimes neighbors too, or co-workers, or anyone who had access to cake. The table had all the usual suspects: cold cuts, potato salad, a fruit plate, fizzy drinks for the kids, and for adults, vodka. Always vodka. After the toasts came singing, maybe some dancing, and lots of storytelling. For kids, parents sometimes hired clowns or puppeteers, though many Soviet children would argue that clowns were more terrifying than festive. Birthday gifts were modest: toys, books, sometimes clothes, but they were given with love and, often, wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. Weddings and funerals, technically not holidays, but still important gatherings. Soviet weddings were part romance, part bureaucracy. First, the couple went to the Zag's office civil registry to get legally married. Then came the party, a giant meal, awkward toasts, and a table so full it bent under the weight of potatoes and dreams. There were traditions. The bride and groom would kiss after each toast. Someone always sang an old folk song, and yes, there was always that one uncle who drank too much and tried to dance with a house. Funerals were somber, respectful, and deeply traditional. Even atheists paid their respects in a quiet, almost spiritual way. People brought flowers, ate simple food, and remembered the deceased with toasts and stories. The unofficial celebration Samas. The best parties weren't official at all. Like when someone finally got a new car, or scored a trip to the Black Sea, or brought back bananas from Moscow. Any reason to gather, share food, and laugh, even if it meant pushing the furniture to the side and sitting on stools around the coffee table, because in the end, Soviet celebrations weren't about extravagance. They were about togetherness, whether it was marching through the snow with a red flag, or sharing pickled mushrooms with your neighbors. Holidays gave people a reason to pause, smile, and say, "Look, we're still here, let's eat." The Soviet soul, what remains after the empire fell. Right, comrade. We've marched through parades, stood in bread lines, sweated through summer in a communal apartment, and now we've reached the end. Not just the end of this bedtime story, but the end of an era, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and what it left behind. Because even though the USSR officially dissolved in 1991, the traces of Soviet life didn't just vanish overnight. They lingered in buildings, in habits, in stories, and most of all, in people. So tonight, as we drift off, let's explore the thing that was harder to define than any 5-year plan, the Soviet soul. December 1991. The empire ends quietly. It didn't explode. There were no fireworks, no dramatic battle, just a press conference, a signed paper, and suddenly, a superpower was gone. 15 new countries emerged from the rubble. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, the Estans, each carving their own path forward. People woke up on December 26th and asked the same question. So. Now what? Some were thrilled. Freedom, democracy. Genes without waiting in line. Others were shocked, confused, even grieving, because love it or hate it, the USSR had been home, a place of shared identity. A strange, frustrating, deeply complex thing they'd built their lives around. Now it was gone. But it wasn't forgotten. What stayed behind the apartment block stayed, gray, boxy, and all identical, still standing tall like tired sentinels of a bygone order. So did the language. Russian remained dominant in many former republics, not because anyone forced it, but because it had woven into daily life, the way people talked to their neighbors, watched the news, or cursed when the plumbing failed. The food stayed too. Olivier salad, buckwheat, pickled everything. Even today, millions of people still make Soviet-style dishes, partly for nostalgia, partly because, well, they're cheap and filling, and don't forget the songs. From war ballads to cheesy 80s synthpop, Soviet music had its own strange charm. To this day, people put it on during family dinners, not ironically, but with real affection. Memory, bittersweet and complicated. Ask someone about life in the USSR, and you'll get all kinds of answers. Some will say, it was awful, we had nothing, we waited in lines, we whispered in fear. Others will say, it wasn't so bad. At least we had jobs, we had order, life was simple, and both can be true, because memory is messy, especially when it's wrapped in both trauma and tradition. Older generations remember the stability, knowing they'd never be unemployed or uninsured. Younger people remember the limits, censorship, shortages, a sense of being stuck in time. And then there are the in-between stories. Stories about how the neighbor fixed your washing machine for free, or how your whole apartment block watched the Olympics together on a black and white TV, or how your parents taught you to make tea the proper way, in a glass, with jam, and quiet conversation. The USSR may be gone, but the culture of adaptation, sharing, and survival. That stayed. The emotional luggage. Post-Soviet countries didn't just inherit infrastructure and bureaucracy. They inherited emotional habits, to like a deep mistrust of authority, or a tendency to keep quiet in public, but speak freely in kitchens. There's a phrase people use, Soviet trauma. It's not always about war or famine. Sometimes, it's about growing up being told one thing, only to find out the world works another way entirely. Imagine living your whole life believing in the system, only to watch it collapse like a badly built snowman. No wonder people felt disoriented. And yet, people moved forward. They adapted. They opened small businesses, got internet access, learned to say okay instead of Kurosho, and they told jokes. Because if there's one thing the Soviet people mastered, it was surviving through humor. The young and the old. Kids in Moscow or Kiev or Almaty scroll TikTok, play video games, and drink bubble tea. Ask them about Lenin, and they might shrug. Ask them about TikTok dances. Now you're speaking their language, but their grandparents still remember standing in line for bananas. Still remember Victory Day parades. Still remember when the future was something you were assigned, not something you chose. Sometimes generations clash. Sometimes they share, like when a babushka tells her grandson how she once made soup out of cabbage water and pride, and he listens, rolling his eyes, but remembering that's the quiet link between the past and the present, not in museums, but at kitchen tables. What Soviet means today Bazilar Echen Sovet. Bukatagon, Yulgon Viekel Reinhakita Eslatma, Bashkler Echen Bujior Belgisidir, Kadik Menat, Kutch, Chidam Lilik, sees Holly Hamfut Bokeler Vsuvener Larda Bolga Vio Rokniko Rases, Har Doimham Coc Emis, Kopincha Retro Estetic Cabi, Busi Yosit Echen Emis, Baki He Utning Malum Berturi Echen Nostalgy, Bayertma Balan, Bida, Adi Lik, Tuzi Lishi, Auger Bu, Tuzil Majuda Cope Bayer Croatia via Hojad Sonikos Ozning Edish Maslaji, Balan Kelgan Bolsaham, Sovet Ruhi, Holly Hamtep Mok Daksosh, Sovet Ruhi Nima, Edimal, Bushisha Idish Larni Saklash Instinct Tider, Harkonde Holada, Yokio Damler Hollyham Navbata Juda Yakin Tarishi, Yoki Konde Bolishadin Qatiy Nazar, Stolda Doimo Choi Vietus Longan Narsa Burrow, Buji Imjanlik via Hazel, Ki and Chilik, via Illaklining Eigenlogy, Imperialining Yuxalishi via Kulashini Korgan Viertasi Kuni Erdal Ab Ishka Kelgans Aukning Ruhini Beljaladi, Bu Kaser, Bu Amali, Bu Jimjana Shur Iy.va Uhali Ham Burrow, Shunde Kilib, Kimdir Siz Ga Oxygi no Nini Takleaf, Kiladi, Yoki Shamal Siznio Dirity Deb Romo Kishin Gizni Tal Ab Kiladi, Bu Sovet Ruhi, Yadrola Klarda Yoki Shire Larda Emis, Emo Made a Narsa Larda, and Sony Narsaler, Bu Hek Kachin Yokomadi, Endi Kelling, Kozing Gizni Yuming, Marsh Killening AKS Ado Larius Oklarga Singib Ketsen, Hame Ogni Shurva Hidi Exodaraga Tushsen, Kirill Har Flarening Shaviri Sizni Isik Kor Padik O Rab Tursen, Chunky Terex Murakab Bolishi Mumkin, Liken Bu Kecha Bu Shunchaki Yukuden Olden Hai Koya.va Bu Haiko Yada sees Omen Koldingas, Chitadingas, Sen Kolding, sees Yeshadingas, Yakshi Uxlang via Ezda Tuding, Kozlering Isni Dam Ulish Uchen Beshilik Re Hakarakimis, Shunchaki Soken Dam Viaos Gina Choi Koldi,